Good afternoon. It's snowy April afternoon. And I'm Jane Vossler, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Community Senior Center. Nice to see you all here. And we're lucky to have Jane here with us. She and her husband were both born in New Zealand and have returned many times over the years, and she's here to tell us about the country. So I'll turn it over to you, Jane. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Hello to everybody. I'm glad to say I'm not in snowy Vermont today. I'm actually in Baltimore, where we now live. Anyway, as asked, I am going to talk about the country of my birth, which is known as Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. Aotearoa was the name that was given by the indigenous people, the Maori. And the reason for it is that when you approach New Zealand, particularly from the water, obviously, the country does seem to be shrouded in cloud. So hence the name. Now, my husband Austin and I haven't been there since 2019, obviously, because of the pandemic. And so what I have done is I actually asked the family to send me photographs of varying things so that I could change my original New Zealand talk. And so please forgive me. Many of you, I fully expect, will have been to New Zealand. Now, the reason I'm putting this up is that many people on this side of the hemisphere don't realize just how far Australia and New Zealand are. Wellington at the tip of the North Island, the southern tip of the North Island, and Sydney are 1,200 miles, and it's very rough ocean. In the old days where everybody had to go by sea, the shipping line didn't have to fully food provision the ship because most people would be seasick most of the way. Now, you'll see that line, dotted line to the right of New Zealand, and I think that's the international date line. And so it's already tomorrow in New Zealand. And of course, the seasons are the opposite. I've just had an email from my sister saying that it's autumn or fall, and she doesn't like the winter very much. Now, here's a closer view of New Zealand because I wanted to give you a sense of exactly where I've come from. Now, I was born in Auckland, but I grew up in Wellington, in the greater Wellington area.
Now what?
I beg your pardon? I'm sorry. Anyway, be that as it may. Once I went to not even high school, I used to take the train every morning and afternoon into Wellington to go to school. And in the winter, the rail line, which was right along the harbour, waves would crash over the train, a bit disconcerting. No, true. My husband, on the other hand, is from the west coast of the South Island. You'll see that Greymouth is identified. And then he went further south to Dunedin to medical school. I did my nursing training at the Hutt Hospital in the greater Wellington area. Oh, sorry. Oh, it helps to, I beg your pardon, I was pressing the wrong buttons. Now, I said that I had grown up in Wellington. Now, this is a lovely watercolor that our family gave us for our 50th wedding anniversary several years ago of Wellington. And for us, this is an immediately recognizable scene. Now, you'll see where the land is sticking out a bit. And if you go slightly to the right, that's where Austin and I had a flat when we were first married, and we were lived in it for 2 years before we moved to London. New Zealand is a mountainous country. It's a land of lakes and rivers and spectacular scenery. It's where Lord of the Rings was made. Now, this particular photograph or picture is of Mitre Peak in Fiordland, down in the very far southwest of the South Island. And it's at the end of the Milford Track. And a whole family have walked the track, or not the grandchildren, but have walked the track. We actually, was my son's honeymoon, and he had to take along his new wife, his parents, who I may say paid for it, and his sister and her partner. And it really is the most incredible scenery. And to end looking directly from one's hotel window at Mitre Peak, which in perfect weather is perfectly mirrored in the water. And I was very fortunate that I actually saw Mitre Peak perfectly outlined before the cloud came in. And now this is a slightly different scene, and I wanted to show you this because New Zealand is mountainous, it's volcanic, and it's also part of the Pacific Rim of Fire, which means that it's subject to mountainous explosions and also earthquakes. And certainly the earthquakes are very, very real. Some of you may have heard about the earthquakes that Christchurch in New Zealand suffered, I think within the last 10 years, very severe indeed. However, this mountain is Ruapehu, and it's one of three in the volcanic plateau in the middle of the North Island. And as you can see, there's a lake going up to Taupo. Now, it's Lake Taupo, which probably had an eruption and became a lake. It's a very deep lake, and it's a very cold lake. However, my sister does have a holiday house on the lake, and they go there, and why she wants to swim in that water, I don't know. It's absolutely freezing. Now, one of the mountains on either side of Lake Ruapehu is Tongariro. Now, that did blow its top, and now it's got a spectacular walk across it. And my husband and both children walked that a number of years ago. It's called the Tongariro Crossing, and that's actually slightly north of Lake Ruapehu. Narahoe is a perfect cone-shaped mountain on the other side of Ruapehu, and one can see always a plume of steam and a bit of ash coming out of that mountain. Now, it is said that the Ruapehu, which is well known for skiing, had an extinct volcano. Well, that wasn't true. My niece and nephew were skiing on the mountain one year when, all out of a clear blue sky, the mountain erupted. And it's an active volcano. Fortunately, they managed to get everybody off with no trouble at all. But one can't go very far in and around the middle of the North Island without seeing these mountains. They are everywhere. Now, because this country, my country of my birth, has got unique fauna and flora and very dense bush, I wanted to give you a sense of just how dense the bush is. You can get lost in it. Now, obviously, there are designated trails within it. But if you happen to wander off the trail, it is very, very easy to get lost. And there are some parts, particularly in the South Island, that are not well explored, and one has to be very careful. In addition, you will note that there are ferns in the forefront of this particular photograph. Now, New Zealand has a variety of different ferns, and the panga is a tall tree It is a fern, and it is known as the tall punga, and it can be called the silver fern. And it's not uncommon now, for example, on sports team jerseys, they will all be black, and on it will be the insignia of the silver fern. And it's because it's one of the indigenous flora, I guess, of New Zealand. And this gives you a different sense of you can see the king punga actually is in the foreground. And this is such a typical scene, water, bush, hills, if not mountains, plenty of cloud, terror after all, and then of course pasture land. And you can't really go very far out of the big cities before you strike scenery like this. Now, New Zealand's got a population of nearly 5 million, if it hasn't actually quite got there. Austin and I left for London in 1968, and then the population was only about 2.5 million. Now, interestingly, we've had a big sort of Asian population, Chinese and Taiwanese and all the other Asian countries who've come to live in New Zealand, and they tend, but not solely, to live in and around Auckland. In addition, we have considerable immigration from the various islands in the Pacific. The Cook Islands are the ones that come immediately to mind. They, like the Maori, are Polynesian, very characteristic. And when I show you some of the pictures of their carvings, you will, for those of you that have been to Hawaii, I think you'll find them very, very similar. Now, as I said, New Zealand is volcanic. And when one goes to Rotorua, which is north of Lake Taupo, you really hit, or you arrive in the where the, if you like, the Earth's crust is very thin. And so this is a very typical scene. You will see the geyser that's blowing, and this is what you do see when you're in and around certain parts of Rotorua. And I used to, as a child, go through Rotorua because my grandfather had a lakeside property at Lake Rotoiti, and I do have a couple of pictures of that, not very good ones, unfortunately, which I will be showing you. Oh, you know what? I missed my tui. I beg your pardon. I did say we had an indigenous population. Anyway, I beg your pardon for that. And here you've got boiling mud. And it's the most unusual terrain because, as you can see in the background, there are plenty of trees. They're probably not indigenous trees. There's been an awful lot of other trees brought to New Zealand. But then you quite unexpectedly and suddenly come upon areas where you've got the hot mud and boiling water and geysers. And here is the boiling water. And if you can look to the left of the screen, you will see the chap is holding a bag. Who knows what it actually is? But you can put, say that was a bag of potatoes. If you put that bag in that boiling water, it would certainly, it's hot enough to cook those. I am assuming that they are potatoes. That anyway gives you an indication of how hot that water can be. And obviously, if you fell in it, you'd be cooked like the spuds. Now, where I spent my summer holidays on Lake Rotoiti, there were hot baths across the lake, and they had been the runoff from an area much like the photographs I've just shown you. I don't know much how far higher up that hills. Oh my goodness, I forgot it was hills something or other. And anyway, we go in the boat across the lake every night before bed to sit. You don't swim in the hot pools. And the one pool that was closest to the waterfall of boiling water, obviously, it's very, very hot. And then they get cooler. And when you got too hot, you just ran along the jetty and plopped into the cold water and then had another go. And of course, it is so strongly smelling of sulfur. And of course, that turns any silver, like your silver bangles, black. Now, in addition to boiling mud and geysers and the rest, New Zealand has some fast flowing rivers. These falls are called the Hooker Falls, and they're on the Waikato River. Now, the Waikato River emerges from Lake Taupo and flows out finally to the sea. It has become commonplace now on the Waikato River to build hydroelectric dams. And the reason, obviously, is because of the fast flowing river, and then when it narrows to falls such as this. Hooker Falls has actually got a bridge across it where the fastest bit of the falls can be seen. And I can remember as a littler girl that I was absolutely terrified of standing on that bridge looking down at Hooker Falls because I was so frightened that the bridge would fall down and that would be the end of Jane. But Hooker Falls, along with the Aotea Rapids and a number of these different fast-flowing points, are spectacular. Now, because this area to the north of Lake Taupo, and it's still part of the strongly volcanic area, they've been able to capture a lot of the geothermal activity. And it's not very far north, or maybe slightly to the west of Hooker Falls, that one can see these immense pipes that have been tapped to capture that steam. And they're spitting, I presume it's just the end bits of the steam out into the air. I remember my father taking us all to have a much closer look at that because he was a mechanical engineer and understood how important capturing this sort of thing was. But as a little girl, I do remember these immense pipes. I can't even guess what they were in diameter, belching this boiling steam, essentially. And it is all part of the geothermal activity of the middle of the North Island. Now, the other thing, as well as the bush in New Zealand, we very much have some unique flora. This is the Pahutakawa. And Maori names, by and large, are phonetic. They were Stone Age people, so that they had no written language. And when the missionaries came to New Zealand, I have to think about this a bit, probably the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, they did try and write down the Maori language. And so it's absolutely phonetic. So when you hear Pahutakawa, it's exactly spelled how it sounds. Now, it's called the New Zealand Christmas tree because it blooms at Christmas time, bearing in mind that the seasons are opposite to us in the Northern Hemisphere. And it is said that when they bloom early, and as vividly as a photograph, and I think one of my daughter-in-laws took this particular photograph, you know that you're going to have a long, hot summer. It's probably hard for you chaps to imagine what it's like to have roast turkey and plum pudding and all the trimmings of the Northern Hemisphere when you're running around in shorts on Christmas Day. but that's indeed what we do. And I actually should probably give you a bit of a history. New Zealand is part of the British Commonwealth. The Queen, Her Majesty the Queen, remains the head of state. New Zealand was formally settled in 1840, and that was when the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, and that ceded New Zealand to the Crown, Queen Victoria, obviously then. And all the chiefs of all the tribes in New Zealand put their mark on, which is represented in their tattooing, incidentally, on that. Now, in recent years, there's been some controversy about the Treaty of Waitangi with the Maori, and it turns out that when you compare the English version of the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840, with the Maori writing, if you like, of it, there is a difference of opinion what the Maori was retaining, and it has led to a lot of trouble in the last few years. I might give you a bit more on that in a minute. Now, I love this painting. This painting of a tui hangs in the sitting room of our house up in Vermont, where we'll be going for the summer next month, just as the watercolor of Wellington hangs in the house. The tui is got a very characteristic sort of caw, caw. It's not a pretty sound, particularly, and it's sometimes called the parson's bird because of the tuft of white under its chin. Now, you'll notice the depth of color in the feathers of the tree, of the bird, and it's sitting on a kowai branch. The kowai has these wonderful yellow flowers, as you can see, and that's the nectar that the tuis prefer. So that this is an absolutely characteristic scene. And we walked into an art gallery in Wellington, actually on our 50th wedding anniversary, and this painting was directly opposite us as we walked in. And I just said to Austin, I'm going to buy that. I absolutely love it. Now, this is not the bird that one tends to think of in relationship to New Zealand. That is the tui, which is I'm sorry, not a tui, this is the tui, a kiwi. And a kiwi is a nocturnal bird that can't fly. And it has brown, fine feathers. And there are certain, I suppose you'd call them museums or natural museums, where you go in and it's very, very dim light, and you will see the kiwi with its long beak puttering around, digging up whatever the bugs are that it eats. Now, funnily enough, I'm called a Kiwi. Austin's called a Kiwi because we are Kiwis. That's the shorthand for saying that one is a New Zealander. And it is also, as we know, kiwi shoe polish and the kiwi fruit. When I was growing up, we called kiwi fruit Chinese gooseberries because they seem very exotic. Well, of course, they're not very exotic, as we know. But when New Zealand decided to market kiwi fruit, really and truly, calling it Chinese gooseberries didn't mean anything. So somebody coined kiwi fruit to name the particular fruit, which I'm sure you all recognize, and now you know. And of course, it grows all over the world now. But that's where the name kiwi fruit comes from. It comes from that funny little brown, nocturnal, flightless bird. New Zealand is an agricultural country, although more and more people are obviously migrating to cities. when I think Austin and I left New Zealand, there were about 70 million sheep. Believe it or not, that many sheep to 2.5 million people. But and we bred a particular type of sheep that we could use both the wool and the meat. And we shipped both mainly to England in those days, but of course that's changed. The wool was a coarser variety and was better for things like carpets. It's not like the very fine merino wool that one sees in sweaters and cardigans today. And that particular breed, the merino, has increasingly been brought to New Zealand, and it is combined with possum. Well, I suppose it's wool that gives you very warm, washable sweaters and the like. But it's so soft. I always have a pair of merino possum gloves, because I have cold hands, in the pockets of my heavier jackets. To the right, you will see the cows, and New Zealand produces a lot of milk. I know Vermont is the heavily milk state of the country, but it is true that New Zealand is very much the same thing. Obviously, we've got milk, cream, yogurt, a great variety of cheeses now. And in the old days, butter and cheese went more or less straight to England to be sold. That's not the case today. And but the fact remains that it's very pure quality, high quality milk, because we've had no foot and mouth disease in New Zealand. The Department of Agriculture are very, very fussy about what you bring into New Zealand that potentially could be lethal to that sort of thing. So I think it's Cadbury's chocolate. I can't remember which the particular company is, but they get all their milk for chocolate from New Zealand. And to the left, you will see a wine bottle. And this is Cloudy Bay Sauvignon Blanc. And this was the first wine of New Zealand to make the international level of quality. And you almost see more vineyards today than you see sheep. That is an exaggeration, obviously, but anywhere that it's possible to plant vineyards, they do. Now, New Zealand really brought Sauvignon Blanc to the forefront for many, many people. This is a very rich, fruity wine. It's got a very big flavor. Sometimes a lot of people don't like that. And for a long time, we basically only produced white wine. But now, particularly down much further south in the South Island, one finds a very good Pinot Noir, which I happen to prefer than the heavier Cabernet Sauvignon, that's right, from Australia. The Shirazes, I just don't particularly care for it. But I just remind you that the backdrop of both of these photographs just, to me, spell New Zealand. I'm not sure that you would, maybe the one on the right reminds you of Vermont, but I'm not sure about that. I love this painting too. It hangs in our house. It's by a very famous New Zealand painter called Simon Williams. And in the background are the Southern Alps, and in the foreground are the Canterbury Plains. And as you can see, you could call them the shepherds or you could call them drovers. But suffice to say, they'll be rounding up the sheep to bring them in for shearing or for dipping their hooves so that they avoid those various diseases, and inevitably the dogs. And the colors, funnily enough, in the foreground are true. Although we tend to think of New Zealand as very green, it isn't always. You get this sort of, I was going to say golden, but it's not really golden. It's this sort of dirty yellow. It's particularly toward the end of the summer, obviously, it is like this. And it sort of changes how you think. But this definitely is the Canterbury Plains, and you can see a river in the background. And the Southern Alps, funnily enough, is where Ed Hillary, the first man with Sherpa Tenzing, got to the top of Mount Everest. Hillary actually trained in those mountains. He was a beekeeper, incidentally. And some of these Alps are marvelous skiing, but not all of them. They can be dangerous. Now, I want to change tracks a bit to talk about the Maori. Incidentally, I should say to you, there are no purebred Maoris left in the whole world. And New Zealand and Australia geologically are actually very different. And it's thought that, that may be confirmed, I really don't know. It is thought that New Zealand sort of erupted out of the ocean. And as I've said, it is volcanic. Australia, on the other hand, which is sometimes called Gondwana land, probably drifted, and it's said, sort of from the Arabian Sea, but I'm not willing to commit to that one way and another. The Maoris came about 1066, which for me is a very good, because that's when William the Conqueror came and bumped Harold off the throne and became the man that we think of as beginning in the UK. But they did row to New Zealand. And they have outrigger canoes of a sort, not unlike those that you see in Hawaii. You can still find these superb Maori canoes in museums and the rest of the sort of place. There was a small population of a previous lot that were in New Zealand, but the Maoris drove them off. They were called, oh, crumbs, I can't remember. But it gives you an idea from where you see when they say the Polynesian Triangle, and at the north, I think it is Hawaii. This is in one of the Maori areas, and this is where a lot of the geysers and mud pools are, outside Rotorua. And anybody who goes to Rotorua as a tourist usually goes to see what life was like in Maori land, if you like. Now, what's interesting about this is that when I was a little girl, and I certainly in primary school sat next to an awfully nice little Maori boy called Lenny, and he was of the local tribe in the Hutt Valley. The Maoris have always been regarded as having the same equal rights as the white people, namely the Pākehā. But of course, their culture was sort of not quite dying, but it was a bit dicey, if you like, for a while. And certainly the use of the language. And just let me say to you that by and large, Maoris do not speak Maori to the whites. They speak it amongst themselves. But all the stationery, for example, now will have a Maori heading. And I'll tell you a little funny story. A number of years ago, probably about 15 years ago, I have a cousin, a very successful economist at Auckland University, who would do 4 classes exactly the same in one day. And all the faculty were ordered to greet each class with the Maori greeting. And she said to me, you know, Jane, By the fourth time I had to repeat it all, I'd sort of given it all up, which was very naughty, and she shouldn't have told me, but that is the case. However, there is a real resurgence of pride in the Maori culture. And there you have, I wish I could remember the name of the famous painter of, he would have been a tohunga, one of the sort of the rangatira class, which are the sort of, if you like, the upper class. This is a copy of this painting that we actually have in the same house. And you can see a model of a Maori canoe beneath it. But part of the reason why I wanted to show you this is that this man didn't paint those tattoos on him. They were carved into his face with no local anesthetic. So you can imagine it must have hurt like the dickens. Now, it was not uncommon for their tribe and or their own name symbols to be carved on the chin. And when I was a little girl, I remember my mother taking my sister and me to Whakariwa, which is where the Maori village is that I spoke about, and to meet she seemed very old, Maori guide named Rangi. And she was one of the few women who still had the moko, which is the family and tribal symbol, on her chin, and her lower lip had been completely tattooed as well. It was that blue-green color. And you'll also notice that hanging around this gentleman's neck is a tiki. And that is a very common symbol of Maoridom. And we've got, needless to say, a number of in our house. And you'll see his earring, which looks like jade. And New Zealand has got a form of jade. It is logically called greenstone, and it's a nephrite. And I just added these particular photographs just really for fun. The women are singing and they're doing the poi dance, which, as you can see in one hand, they've got two pois. And by golly, when you see them swinging those pois, it's quite spectacular. A Maori warrior up on the left-hand side, and formal greeting is rubbing noses with each other. And you do see when any member of the British royal family comes to New Zealand, there will be a celebratory rubbing of noses. The men down on the left are doing a haka. The haka is a war dance, and the faces that were pulled were meant to threaten the enemy. All the boys in high school, their school will have a haka. My husband went to Wellington Boys, which is a high school obviously in Wellington, and to this day he can still do the haka, which is performed by the team before rugby players play, and they're known as the All Blacks because they wear a black shirt with the silver fern. And above them, you can see one of their canoes. And I can tell you, having seen a number of them, one of which is in Tipapa, which is the National Museum in Wellington, these are spectacular. A lot of them were built of kauri, and kauri is a hardwood and grows very straight and tall with not too many branches. I cannot tell you how long it would have taken to hollow those out, but I feel sure because they only had stone adzes to work with. Now here's Austin, standing in front of the gate into the pa that is Whakariwa. When I was a little girl, we said Whakariwa. But during this resurgence of Maori culture, WH became F. Now you'll note that each of these figures have got what it pretends to be a greenstone club. And the best greenstone, funnily enough, comes from the fast-flowing rivers in the west coast of the South Island. And these, if those had been real, they are extremely valuable. I can't tell you what all the symbols mean, the figures, except that they look pretty fierce. They're meant to scare anybody coming near. Now, the palisades were often at 1, 2, and 3, so one just didn't go through the gate into the village. One had to get through each level of fences before you actually got formally into the village. And this in Whakarewa is the meeting house. And this is where families would congregate, or the tribal members would congregate and sit on the most beautifully woven mats. And within the meeting house are a series of pillars the whole way along. And on those pillars, if you knew how, you could read the history of that particular tribe. And please note, at the top of that meeting house, foray, is a figure, and that is called a teko teko, and a teko teko is meant to wish you good luck. And we have a fine teko teko in the Vermont house that we, funnily enough, got at the Auckland Museum, which we always go and have a look at when we are in New Zealand. And this is exactly what, even though this is in the village that all the tourists visit, this is exactly as it should be. There will be no other windows or doors. It is simply this one window and one door that one lies in. Now, I will divert slightly because I want to tell you a family story. If you remember, I said that no Maori, by and large, will speak Maori to a white man. Well, for about 40 years, my grandfather, whose holiday place I stayed at Lake Rotoiti, did free legal work for the local tribe, and he was made an honorary chief of that tribe. And after he had had his formal white funeral in Rotorua, he was brought out to the Maori village, and he lay in state, not 3 days, just 24 hours, as an honorary chief within that, with the Wahinis wailing. And thereafter, he and my step-grandmother were buried in the number 2 chieftain's lot. And this gives you a sort of a full-scale teko teko, and you get the sense of how fearsome these figures are meant to be. I only stuck this one in, and I think I've taken all of these photographs, is because this is a storehouse. And you'll note that it's up on stilts, and that was to avoid rats, which were introduced into New Zealand, and other nasties from getting into their supplies. But you'll see how delicate and beautiful all that carving is. And it really is like that. Here's Lake Rotoiti. I can't remember which daughter-in-law took this. I love this one because it's sunset. And they're black swans, interestingly. And there's actually a gloomy day. And I remember plenty of those when I was a little girl. And this is probably taken from right on the edge of the lake where the lawn from my grandfather's house ran down to the water. So the opposite side there wasn't very far away, as you can see. And of course, I have many, many sympathetic, marvelous memories. Today, or over the last month, I suppose, there's been great excitement in New Zealand, and this is Auckland Harbour, with the Sky Tower in the background, because New Zealand has just won again the America's Cup, which is the great international sailing race. This is the boat that they sailed in. Auckland is a wonderful harbour for sailing, and many, many people obviously have a sailboat. I've seen the Cup. It is a spectacular, tall, but an elaborate cup, and it is in now. It resumes again in the Royal New Zealand Yacht Squadron, which is right on the water to the right of where you see this. It's very close to the bridge that spans the harbour. My father was a member of the yacht club for over 50 years. He wore the tie with pride. And he, when we decided to celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary, we'd actually were married in Lower Hutt, not in Auckland. But I went and talked to the Royal New Zealand Yacht Squadron folk and told them the story. And they said, "Oh, we'd love to give a party for you since your father was a member for so many years." And so that's exactly where we celebrated 50 years. I'd just like to comment, because I know I'm beginning to run out of time, and I'm pretty well finished anyway, but look at the color of the water. I always talk about the New Zealand blues and the Pacific Ocean in and around New Zealand will go from deepest sapphire blue to deep emerald. And sometimes with the kelp near the shore, it looks almost burgundy color. As long as I live, I will never forget the color of the water in and around New Zealand. There's just no question, it's spectacular. And I just thought for fun, since I've talked about my family, and I have to admit that this is a very old photograph, but we haven't been out en famille for a few years. The little boy on my daughter-in-law's shoulders is the third Austin in the group. My husband's actually Austin the fifth, and he's now 10 years old. So that gives you an idea. My son Austin's got his arm around his eldest daughter, Isabel, who's now 17 and going off to college. The little tot between my daughter-in-law Jennifer and me is Katie, and she's now 12. And I've got my arm around Felicity, known as Lissy, and she's 15. My husband's on the right behind me, and on the far left is my daughter, Charlotte. And I just thought, since I've had so much help from Amita and Jennifer, who really are the photographers of the family, and our son Austin went down to the house to take the photographs of the paintings that I showed you. And that's all I have to say. Now, I just make one observation. I am an American citizen, so you've got the eagle on your left, but I still hold a New Zealand passport. So you see the Kiwi on the right. And if you like, that's my imprimatur. When I am lecturing nurses, I always have the first and last slides with those two birds. And it's been my pleasure today to talk about the country of my birth, and I hope that you've all found it of interest.
Thank you, Jane. It was very interesting.
Good.
Anyone have any questions?
What did you do in London? You lived in London, you said, or moved to London. What did you do in London?
My husband did his medical training in New Zealand, but he went to London to do his neurology specialist training, and our daughter was born in London, and I worked for a society doctor as a nurse and made children's fancy dress costumes. And it was from London that he was recruited first to San Francisco, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and now we're in retirement. We're both adjunct professors at Johns Hopkins here in Baltimore.
Thank you.
I am Ray. I missed, my grandchildren are here, so I missed part of your presentation. Where do you live in Vermont?
South Burlington. We're in Shelburne Bay, right on the lake.
Okay. We went in 2015. We went to Australia and New Zealand. We spent 2 weeks in each place. New Zealand is my favorite place to go.
Well, that's nice to hear.
It's beautiful. The country includes the Maori race. You know, everything around the island is all centered around them. They keep the Maori names for places. I would love to go back again.
Well, maybe you will. I think it's a question of probably saving your pennies. For those of you that haven't been, a lot of people are a bit apprehensive from this country because the travel is so long. And, you know, obviously you've got to get across the country, the US, and then it's about a 12-hour flight down to Auckland. But it's night flying, so you get on board, have a stiff drink, and take a sleeping pill and wake me for breakfast in the morning. And that's exactly what Austin and I do. And so it seems to be a trip that passes very quickly for us. And of course, since we left in '68, we've been, I don't know how many times we've been back. I went out every year in our summer, their winter, to have 4 days with my mother, because there's 2 days traveling on either end, and I couldn't afford to be away from my job longer than that, just 4 days with her.
So your children all live in New Zealand now?
No. None of them were born in New Zealand. Charlotte was born in London, and Austin was born in San Francisco. Now, Austin and Jennifer and the three little girls live in Vermont. Charlotte and Amita and Austin, live here in Baltimore. That's why we moved from New Orleans.
I'm wondering how many people in the audience have been to New Zealand.
Yes, I wonder too.
Can you raise your hand? Speak out. Two, three. And how many people would like to go?
I want to go back again.
Well, we're debating about going home for Christmas. The trouble is, and we can get in because we've got New Zealand passports and we're fully vaccinated, but they're automatically putting everybody into 2 weeks quarantine. Well, that's a long time when you're only planning to go for about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But we're just hoping that they'll have eased things up a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions? Well, thanks a lot, Jane, for sharing all of that with us. It was fascinating.
Well, it was my pleasure.